I want to thank everybody for listening. I've written down a bunch of the questions in the chat box. I didn't know if those are the ones that if you have any more. And then those were yesterday also, right?
Yeah, so those were the ones that I was gonna kind of go through, and maybe I'll just read them out so everybody can hear them again. So
that's fine.
Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, and then also yesterday there was a question asked that said "defer to me" about Cesar Chavez and Braceros. Do you remember that?
Okay.
Yeah, and so I thought about that, and the initial answer to that question is that Cesar Chavez was not supportive of the Bracero program. That's very well documented, very well known. The Bracero program was an impediment to unionization of farm workers in the United States. And many times when farm workers would go on strike or have work slowdowns, farmers would bring in contracted braceros to take the workplace. So he was against it because it was an impediment to unionization, but also he was against it for human rights purposes because braceros were abused. And I think one of the important things that you need to look and think about Cesar Chavez, who was a great man, and is that you have to look at him in the 1960s and in 2020, because the situation in the 1960s in regard to for farm workers, braceros, would be a lot different today. So you can't go back and change history, and you can go online and see controversial videos of Cesar Chavez saying things with braceros. Well, but that's, to me, that's different. This is 2020, and that's the times. But he was very concerned about their human rights, but the reality is the Bracero program, when it ended in '64, is a time when the United Farm Workers really took off. Because has to fill the vacuum. So I hope that answers it. I think that whole period of unionization is real important. And Cesar Chavez, as I said, is an important man. The high school district that I taught at in Phoenix, Arizona for many years has a high school named after him. And in the state of Arizona, Cesar Chavez Day is a holiday. So, which I think it should be nationwide. Okay.
Definitely. No, definitely. And I spent a lot of time in Southern California, and it's the same there.
Yeah. Exactly. Perfect.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to start with the first question that I saw come in from gordonsisk, and he asks, were many Mexican workers coming in before the war?
So during the Depression, and there was also a question about the Depression also, a lot of the farm workers from Mexico, some from Central America too, were kicked out of the United States. There was a shortage of jobs in the U.S., of course, during the Great Depression. There was an attempt, especially, to bring workers out to, remember the Grapes of Wrath, all that stuff, bring them out to California, etc. And there was a deportation movement in the 1930s, and it was very controversial because a lot of American citizens were deported at the same time. There were no questions asked, you're deported. There were a lot of them moved out, etc. So yeah, there had been they were kicked out, and so this was important because of the war, bringing them back in.
Right. Okay. Definitely. All right. From Brianne Wagter. Is there any data or information about how many Mexican workers who participated in the Bracero program were impacted by the repatriation, the repatriation movement sparked by the Great Depression? Oh. Well, I guess this was the same question, but.
Well, when I saw that question also with the repatriation, and part of that is, one of the controversies of the program was that some of their wages were sent to the government in Mexico, and they never realized their wages. And then years later, the Mexican government attempted to do a settlement, and they called it a reparations movement. And I think about probably a quarter of the Braceros somehow were impacted, getting some sort of financial thing. I'd have to double check that. But that was like like when the U.S. government paid for the Japanese and their families and things like that, the Mexican government actually made reparations for ripping off the Braceros because the Mexican government took in a portion of their wages.
Wow. From Ray Sun, he asks, how does the minimum wage of 30 cents an hour compare to average wages in the U.S. in 1942 to 45?
So, and I looked it up because that minimum wage rate seemed to have stayed the whole time, but it showed that the average American wage was about $3,000 a year by the end of the war, which was about what, $2 an hour. So, I mean, leaving the farm work was the way to go to earn money during the war, especially for women. And so the Brisettos were the lowest paid workers.
Right. Yeah, by a lot. From Julie Ornelas, she asks, were only men allowed into the program?
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, there were during World War II, and later it was a men program. Later on in the 60s, you saw the entrance of some women working in contracted labor, but yeah, it was primarily for male workers. And during the war, especially later on, some of the Brisettos were able to bring their wives and their families. There's actually still existing just south of me area of homes where some of them live with their families. But a lot of them lived in dorms, things like that.
Monica Pahovich asked, she's mentioned that she thought it was interesting that the president exempted agricultural workers, and she says, do you know why?
Oh, because we need food, Monica. Yeah, there's a farm worker shortage, and so the workers that enter under those visas. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, the field just right next to my house. I live on a farm. The workers that are under this program were back working on the field, and they were not using short hose. They were using long hose. But I have seen a short hoe being used before. Short hose are banned now, and because they're dangerous, they're destructive to a body and so there is a worker shortage in agriculture, and during this pandemic, you saw in a lot of agriculture industries, you saw these massive spreads of COVID in meatpacking plants, etc. So we need workers, and the reality is that it's hard to find workers. A lot of the average American does not want to do farm labor. I mean, that's a reality. I've seen that my whole life.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Monica answered that in the chat. Americans won't take those jobs. No, they won't. They're backbreaking jobs.
Yeah. Ed Tweed said he has a question. He was wondering about the braceros and the agricultural unionization, which we had mentioned earlier with Cesar Chavez, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, so braceros that were able to stay and all that, a lot of them did become involved in the United Farm Workers, but Cesar Chavez was recruiting and farm workers from, especially in California, individuals who were immigrated to California, born and raised in California. But no, there were braceros who stayed in the U.S. My best friend's father stayed and worked in the U.S. and he went to go work for Stallman Farms eventually, which is a large pecan producer. But a lot of them stayed in the United States. A lot of them became members of the union in the 60s. I mean, in many states, you had to be, after the Braceto program, a part of the union, the United Farm Workers. And the H-2A visa program, I just thought in my head, it's the Braceto program. It runs under the same premise of the Braceto program. Contracts, the agriculture producers, the farmers have agents in Mexico. They get contracts. It's the same thing, the same type of program. So the Braceto program has not ended.
Yeah. Here's another question from Monica, and this is the last one that I see popping up. So if anybody else wants to ask more questions, go for it. Or you can try raising your hand and ask it to Juan yourself. But this question from Monica is, did Bracero workers generally seek citizenship?
Did they what?
Generally seek citizenship.
Citizenship. Some of them did. My friend Cesar, his father became a U.S. citizen. And so, yeah, the Braceros that stayed here, they qualified, they became citizens. They went through the whole process. And yes, the ones that stayed here were legally allowed to apply for citizenship, etc. The other thing that I briefly touched on, and yesterday was mentioned too, that I think is interesting to point out is braceros were treated differently in different places in the country. For that short period in World War II, the bracero program ended in Texas because of the violence against braceros in Texas. Braceros especially enjoyed working in the upper Midwest, in New Mexico, Arizona, and California.
Interesting.
I included a bunch of resources that teachers can go and look for. Some of the interviews, the videos in there are really good. I encourage you guys to look at those. There's some of the grandchildren and sons and daughters of braceros are doing a lot of oral histories. Braceros from post-World War II that are still alive are doing a lot of oral histories, and some of them are amazing about they talk. And there's a lot of conversations, and I had some comments on the short hoe. There's a lot of videos coming up and them talking about the use of the short hoe. And so I think that's interesting. There's also now a monument to braceros in Los Angeles that was just recently dedicated.
That's awesome. Yeah, you have such a wealth of resources. So I hope that we can send out your presentation.
I appreciate the time and the opportunity, and I hope everybody joined it. I've been listening and on in this. Yesterday was great. World War II vets. They were fantastic.
Oh, good. Yeah. No, and we have General McGee coming on later this afternoon, so hopefully it'll be just as wonderful. I see a couple more questions. How are you feeling? Do you want to answer a couple more of them?
I don't have another. I'm going to be listening in on this and then listening on another Zoom. I'm double Zooming today. Gosh.
Oh, okay. Great. So from Brianne Wegter, she asks, I found it interesting to see the Americans All poster, which promoted togetherness and seemed to highlight the importance and contribution of braceros. Anything like that today, as immigrants still make critical contributions to American agriculture?
I haven't seen, the World War II poster. I haven't seen anything like that. I thought that was an amazing poster. I liked it. I'd like to have a printed copy of that. That to me is a good thing to hang up in the classroom, etc. If I ever see that, I'll let you know, and then if I ever see something similar to that today, then.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good thing to keep an eye out for. From Ray again, were the Cortitos used in Mexico traditionally, or were they created specifically for migrant labor in the U.S.?
No, so I would say both. They were used, but they're used in Mexico. As a matter of fact, in Mexico, you can still buy them used today. Somebody had asked me a question about that, because you can't buy them here; they're banned. But I know that I've seen them a few years ago in Ciudad Juarez. And I know that they are still used down in parts of Mexico. Yeah, so they're still around, and they had them, and some of them brought them and took them back. So they are using the long hose today. I saw the workers yesterday using in the field next to me. They're growing hemp, and I saw them. I saw them using long hose. So
interesting.
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Student project for posters. That's sort of cool.
Definitely. Yeah, that's so cool. From Maggie B, did the Bracero program have any impact on tenant farmers or former tenant farmers?
No, so with the ending of the Depression, the start of the war, a lot of those individuals who had especially migrated to the West in California, tenant farmer, a lot of them, the men went into war. They went into war production. Jobs, so a lot of them left agriculture. Agriculture was lacking in the West and the Southwest, all over the country, because everybody was going to war. And one of the things about labor is when the men go to war, then the women go to work. But the women were needed in the factories. Women are needed in the factories. So the only option was to bring in workers. And the other thing about the H-2A program, thinking about men and women, I looked yesterday at the field next to me. There were more women working than men. So today in the program, yeah, I made an observation about that. It was interesting how many women were working compared to men.
Right. Interesting how things change.
Yeah.
All right, so I think this is going to be our last question, and then we'll go to a brief break. But this is from Mariko Komatsu, and they ask, how did your students like learning of this topic? And they would love to know their reactions and reflections if you could share.
Okay. So we do this towards the end of the semester because we do our timeline in U.S. history, World War II, and we will always find, because there are a lot of migrant workers and migrant workers' children in where I live in the Las Cruces area, and descendants of farm workers and bracero programs. So I have a lot of students who can relate to this. I have a lot of students who work in agriculture, and so they relate to this. It's a good topic. I think it's a great topic on the history and the relationship between Mexico and the United States. Where I live, I would say we probably have a higher percentage of first generation Americans. I'm a first generation American, and so my mother's an immigrant, and so it's a high interest for my students, I would say, because they can relate to it, and I think that's important.
Yeah, certainly.
Anyway, but I appreciate the opportunity.